right, question. Where do you get your news? Is it social media? Maybe it's a blog, website, or is it TV or radio? Most likely, it's all of the above. But have you ever wondered how that information is created? And is it reliable? And what is the difference between a journalist and an author of a social media story or some of these conspiracy stories that are often out there? How do you tell the difference between credible journalism versus the content that floods your social media feeds? Well, to answer some of your questions, we're taking you inside a newsroom, so to speak, to see how the sauce is made. Joining us to talk is Ram Ramgopal. He's executive editor in charge of vetting the editorial content that is presented on CNN. All right, Ram. So here's the question. For many of us who work in this business, we often forget that our friends or people that reach out to us, that bring us story ideas, don't really know what happens inside a newsroom, what we do. And so my first question for you is, what do you do?
Well, I am one of the executive editors who's responsible for vetting content, as you described it. I look at things that are particularly those that are controversial, sensitive, alleged wrongdoing, things that if we get factually wrong would be an embarrassment to the brand that I represent, or if we get it really wrong, that we could face legal consequences. So the job that I handle on a day-to-day basis is one of ensuring that everything that we put out is accurate, it's balanced, and that it has been vetted to the best of our ability. So that is the nature of the job that I do on a daily basis.
Okay. So I don't know if this happens to you a lot, but it happens to me all the time. I will hear from a friend or family member or even someone in the community that's reaching out with an interesting piece of information that they saw on Facebook, a news story or a tweet that had something interesting in it that you have just got to cover. And I know for me, I love getting story ideas from people. Word of mouth, that's the best. But I think for a lot of people, they think we're just going to turn around and run with it, and it winds up on the air. But that's just not the case. There is a process for actually looking at that piece of information, vetting it. So talk a little bit about that. That happens to you, I'm sure.
All the time.
Yeah.
There are two ways, and I'm glad you brought that up. Partly, sometimes people call us. Sometimes people reach out via Twitter. I'm very active on social media, and people will reach out and say, you've got to look at this story. Sometimes it's our own reporters who have already gotten this story and have spent sometimes weeks, maybe months, maybe years digging into a story. And everything that they gather is not put on the air immediately. If it is something that we get as a way of a tip, there are shades of that. Sometimes you may get news of a power outage. Somebody calls and says, you won't believe just what just happened. We just had a power outage. And the journalist in you automatically gets the adrenaline going to say, oh, that is news, because we've got to get to the bottom of this. But there is a process of vetting this, and figure out, is this widespread? How many homes are affected? Is there something else that's going on? Could it have been caused by the weather? Could it have been caused by some sort of unusual event, perhaps an attack of some sort? So that's when it starts to escalate. At every point, you have your guard up, because if you think that something is too good to be true, it probably is not true, So it may need a lot of vetting, a lot of checks to that process. And when it comes to social media, I would advise, consumers. I'm a consumer myself first. When I see something on the Twitter feed, I pause and I say, is this possible? Does it fit the context? Is there something here that we need to dig into? Is there something that we may be missing? Is there another explanation? And it's only after that we get to the next stage of whether we should be doing the story. And depending on the urgency of that could be squeezed into a few seconds. Sometimes it could be several minutes. Sometimes, as I said, it could be days or months or years. So each story, I think, needs to be treated with that degree of skepticism, no matter what it is. And that's what I would advise every consumer to be skeptical, but also know that there are certain brands of news outlets that take great care and pride in what they do. The vast majority of news outlets do. So proceed, but with caution, and know what you're consuming has been vetted, but make your own educated guesses.
Right. And not everybody that is putting content out there is an actual trained journalist. And that doesn't mean that what they're putting out there doesn't add value. It just means that they're not, trained in terms of what we do and how to do it, because certainly one aspect of the job is sourcing.
Right.
So I know sometimes, as I'm watching CNN, and for a lot of people, they'll hear, one of the hosts talk about my sources, my sources. Explain a little bit about that, because there are sources.
Exactly. So just because the sources are anonymous does not mean that they don't exist. It's a very high bar to get an anonymous source on the air, in print, and that's the case with every reputable news organization. Most news organizations would insist on getting at least two sources of, to provide the information. So if one source says this is what happened, a second source will need to confirm that. The exceptions to that, as you know, Leah, is when somebody's speaking on the record. If it's a police commissioner, if it's the governor of his state speaking on camera or at a news conference, that's fact, and you're going to say Governor John Brown says this. But if it's somebody who's speaking on background, this is a process that is negotiated between the reporter and the source who's giving this piece of information. Now, the source may not want to reveal the information with their name attached to it because they're too close to the situation. It would embarrass them, but they feel that the story needs to be out there. And that's one of the reasons why a reporter cultivates those sorts of sources. And again, it's a negotiation. It's not a one-way street. So I think this is something that people need to be aware of, that the anonymous sources that you hear about are people who have chosen to go anonymous, and the reporter has agreed that this person would go on background without their name. And then this has to be cleared by somebody like me. That's one of my jobs, is that I clear anonymous sourcing, but it's usually through a very lengthy process, a checklist in my mind, which I have to go through to see whether these benchmarks are met before a source is allowed to speak anonymously.
So there's verification, making sure that this person is who they say they are, that they actually have this kind of information, but it's not just, someone told me.
Exactly. And the source who's providing this information can provide some sort of backup to what they're saying. Either in terms of a record, maybe documents, something which supports what they're saying, but also the context. Now, the person who's making these sometimes it's allegations, but sometimes it's just information. The person who's providing you this information is also, in a way, in a position to know what they're saying, they're giving you. That's another important part of this conversation. And it's not something that we willy-nilly would allow somebody to give that piece of information. One other thing that an anonymous source, which most news organizations will not allow to get on air or in print, is basically when they make an ad hominem attack, if it is something that is critical of another person where the other person does not have a chance to respond. Those are the kinds of things we don't like. It's usually information that is critical, that needs to get out. The person is not willing to give you on the record, but is willing to go on background to give you. Those are the kinds of things that we vet before this information gets on air.
So there are some tenets of journalism that journalists follow. A couple of them are truth. Democracy really does depend on that, and our credibility as well. Verification, we've talked about that. We really are the watchdogs, where we hold political people empowered. We hold them accountable, and we ask questions for the public. Also, inclusivity. We try to be as inclusive as we can. Now, that is how it works when you're a trained journalist working in a traditional newsroom. But for social media sites or people with a political agenda, that's not always the case, because they're not following the same tenets we are. It might be, it's just not the same.
Exactly. And to go back to your previous question, you said that sometimes, if the person who's not trained but is providing that information, it could be an actual video of something that's happening or something that they've seen before their eyes. They've actually witnessed it, and they're providing that information on a platform. They are not necessarily thinking of the balance that one needs. If there is an accusation, particularly against somebody, we as journalists will bend over backwards to make sure that we're giving the person who's being accused of that a chance to respond. That is just, it's just out of fairness at the heart of it, but it's also for legal reasons. You want to make sure that the person you're making an accusation against is getting a chance to actually give their point of view. And for us as journalists, there's nothing more important than trying to make sure that we are going out of our way, bending over backwards to give people enough time to respond sometimes. And the lay public may not realize that sometimes, but we take great pride and take a lot of time to do that.
Yeah. I want to get to one of these questions from a viewer. And this question is, why has the journalism profession shifted to using inflammatory language and denouncing ideas which the media organization disagrees with? Your thoughts? I'm
not sure that's an entirely accurate way of describing it. I think most people need to differentiate between reporters bringing stories to the fore, doing the reporting, and publishing it, airing it, in television, especially CNN being a television platform. We have reporters doing their reporting, talking to people, getting information, and commentators being on panel discussions with differing points of view. I think sometimes viewers might mistake a commentator for being a professional journalist. Now, as the moderator, Leah, as you are right now, you are driving the conversation in a panel discussion, and you will try to make sure that you get another point of view if somebody says it. But as an anchor, you're also pushing back against something that is, to be false. And that is something which I think any trained journalist will do. The lay public sees it when there are panel discussions on television, but in real life, in news conferences, press conferences, journalists are often challenging their elected officials, holding them to account in that format. And it's not always, the lay public may not always see that, but that happens on a routine basis where we're challenging officials, especially if we know things are different from what they're presenting. So the point is that I don't think it's escalated, but I think the use of social media and people being able to use social media to get their points of view out has certainly raised the pitch in some ways. But I would say that most professional organizations will still have a core set of values, standards, and practices that they abide by, which is basically what I've always been talking about, which is basically to make sure that you have the other counterpoint of view, and also you're reporting the facts as you know them and not opinion.
Right. And I do think in these particular contentious times, we do see a lot of opinionators. We do see commentators that are mixed in with journalists, and that may be some of the reason for this belief that a news organization has skews to a certain political viewpoint. I know here at GPB, we cover the news. That's it. and we work on a set of facts where 1 + 1 = 2. It's never going to be 1 + 1 = 3 because I say so, and I sit in the White House and I say so, or wherever. You know, it's just 1 + 1 = 2, and that's what we cover. We work off of a basic set of facts, and that's all we have. We're not interested in skewing to a certain political party. That's not what we do, and I think that's what you're talking about. But I do think that's where the confusion comes in, where we have opinion journalism, which is funny that it's called journalism because it's actually not. It's more thought. It's not journalism, and advocacy journalism or advocacy, thought, and those things you may find on your social media feed, and they typically go toward the viewpoint you already have.
Right, exactly, and the confusion that people have is that the traditional journalism used to be just layer one facts, which was basically who, when, what, why, and there was always somebody else who would present. So they would quote somebody else giving you the facts. But the reporter also has an amount of expertise that they can bring to bear here, and that is where I think it crosses into the next level, where from just the facts you have analysis, but it's built on years and years of experience in your beat. So, for instance, somebody covering the Supreme Court, having seen many, many justices over the years and decades, might have more of sort of like an institutional knowledge that they can use to sort of give context to the story they're reporting. That's analysis. The next level is where I think most journalists are very uncomfortable with, which is opinion, pure opinion. And that is something that is, I think, almost any professional journalist would balk at, because that's, A, it's not our expertise, and B, it's not really productive at the end of the day.
Yeah. Before we go, I have to ask you this. Democracy all across the world is being challenged in many countries, including ours. Journalism is one of the very important parts of a democracy, and I want you to talk about that. Why is journalism so important, and why do we fight so hard for it?
Yeah, well, I come from India originally. I was born in India, as you probably tell by listening to me. But which is a very large democracy, and I've been in the U.S. for close to 28 years now, and I'm now an American citizen. And to me, when I first came to this country, the thing that I was really struck by, I had worked as a professional journalist in India. The thing that struck me about this country's First Amendment, it is the First Amendment. And the idea that you could express any thought, it doesn't matter if it was a false thought, but you have the freedom to express it, and that you cannot be prosecuted on the basis of just expressing a thought. And to me, that was stunning, because to me, I think that's the bedrock of democracy. And the marketplace of ideas, that you have people expressing their idea, their points of view. And of course, as journalists, we are not expressing our opinions, but we are taking very seriously this aspect of getting at the truth.
Yes. All right. Thanks, Ram. Thank you.